Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to the final session of day two of CALC. I'm really happy to welcome Christine to this final session. Over to you, Christine.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here today. I know it's getting late for some of you, so I appreciate you being here today. I am here to talk about my research on the experiences of neurodivergent librarians, and specifically in the context of US libraries. And if you didn't notice on my title slide, I want to point out that this work was funded by IMLS, Institute of Museum and Library Services, although our grant has now been terminated, like so many others. The postdoc that I was going to use to continue this work, that grant was also eliminated. And so while we are seeking other funding sources to continue this work, I feel like it's really important to acknowledge that the future of this work and of libraries in general in the US is increasingly difficult and uncertain. And that sort of underlies the work that I am doing as well. I also wanted you to know what to expect today as I am sharing my work today. So we're going to begin with an access acknowledgement. I'll give you an overview of my research project before we dig into the findings from this work. I will conclude with a number of practical steps that library organizations and you as individuals could take at your libraries. And I made sure that we have lots of time for question and answer and discussion at the end. If you're a person who likes to follow along with slides, you should be able to access them there. I didn't check it this morning, so I apologize if that's not actually up and working. It was yesterday, so hopefully you can get them there. So this is just a reminder here that everyone has needs. That includes you. It also includes me. So you can see that captioning is enabled. And this is a reminder that I may need to ask for questions to be repeated when we get to that portion. I may need time to process questions. You may notice me fidgeting. I'll talk a lot with my hands. It's just kind of a stimming thing for me. And so as we spend the next maybe a little less than an hour now together, I just invite you to think about how to care for your needs in this space today. And remember, this is being recorded. So if you need to step away, just do that. You can come back and watch the recording later. And I also wanted to go over some language because I get a lot of questions doing this work about terms and definitions and which words are best to use. So this is a reminder here that neurodiversity is a term that remains contested. In some cases, it's used to refer to a biological fact, at least what's seen as a biological fact, to an ideology, to a social movement. But this term originates from the idea that neurological differences are an aspect of human variation. And it's an attempt to sort of name the idea that some minds and ways of being are assumed to be normal, while others are not. This includes all sorts of different forms of neurodiversity like autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, OCD, many more. Neurodiversity is also kind of an umbrella term that includes both neurotypical people and neurodivergent people. And so neurotypical people are those whose minds align with dominant social norms, and thus they get to be considered typical. And neurodivergent refers to those whose minds don't align with those social norms and expectations. This language is in flux, and there are other terms that are being used to refer to this. It's also sometimes called neurodistinct, neuroatypical, neurospicy. There are other terms emerging too, and preferences about this vary. So, if you're wondering, it's always best to ask how someone might identify themselves, or you can mirror how they're using their own language there. Um, People also ask me about like person first versus identity first. So person first language, as in person with a disability, was adopted in the 1970s. And this was really in resistance to a lot of the stigma that existed at the time around disabilities. And so the intention here was to place emphasis on the importance of the person and all of the various facets of their identity. In the ensuing years, a lot of disability activists and scholars have really questioned whether or not this framing actually serves to reinforce the disability stigma, right? If it potentially requires you to assert your personhood as a disabled person. And so that led then to the development of identity first language, which flips that person first language construction and really is intended to emphasize disability as an identity and as a positive aspect of a person's identity. So as a neurodivergent researcher myself, I tend to prefer identity first language. And so you'll hear me use that throughout this presentation. But some groups, however, do still prefer that person first language. And so again, this is one of those things where it's best to ask and be aware of the communities and the individuals and their preferences. All right, so now we're going to get to the part where I'm going to tell you a little bit about my research project. So I set about doing this research, and really it was needed because librarianship is a field that appears to be appealing to neurodivergent people. And yet, library literature largely overlooks the existence of neurodivergent library workers. As in so many other facets of our work, the focus is on patrons. Additionally, things like the ALA core values, right, that we have here in the US, those are not consistently practiced in library workplaces. They might be present in our programs and our services, but we don't apply things like access and equity to our own workplaces. And additionally, the existing research on neurodiversity employment mainly focuses on IT fields, and that's especially true here in the US as well. So the goal of my work then was to adjust to the norms and expectations of librarianship in order to enact new workplace practices that will improve the ability and capacity of libraries to recruit, onboard, retain, and especially to advance neurodivergent librarians. And so the focus then of my work is really on the ways that we can transform the values and the focus of the profession. I also want to note that an important part of doing this work, especially as a neurodivergent researcher myself, was intentionally doing research differently. Because historically neurodiversity research has been done to neurodivergent people from a very medicalized perspective that's really focused on diagnosis and individual characteristics and modifying the person or their behaviors in some way. So my work then really is in resistance to that perspective and works in opposition to that, right? By adopting a neurodiversity and a critical disability theory approach to conducting research with and by neurodivergent people themselves. And doing that in a way where the focus is on structural changes that we can make in libraries, changes in practice, things that will improve the lives of neurodivergent people in ways that align with the things that are important to them and their priorities and their perspectives. And here's a quick overview of sort of what I've been doing. So the first part of my research really involved identifying what's happening in libraries. And so I interviewed neurodivergent librarians and supervisors and conducted some interviews with neurotypical librarians as well to understand some of the existing practices in libraries, as well as things like organizational culture. My project is part of a bigger grant, and so we also did a big nationwide survey We've done some participatory design sessions that are focused on developing training and resources for managers and employees. And all of this work then is leading to a toolkit. We did just secure some funding. So we are going to be working on that this summer. That we can make available to libraries and MLIS programs to take up this work of making and improving their workplaces for neurodivergent library workers. All right, this is a reminder for me and for all of us that everything is super hard right now. So I built in a little self-check for all of us because I know I probably need water and a sip of coffee because it's still a little early in the morning here on the west coast of the US. Um, so I'm going to take a sip of water. I invite you to do the same, and then we'll get into the findings because that's the part I always get excited about. So it's important for me to have a break here before I really get going. All right, so I'm going to take a deep breath. And now I'm going to tell you about the part that gets me excited. Because this is where I got to talk to lots of neurodivergent librarians and hear about their experience. Because that was an important part of this work, right? In order to do this work according to the perspectives of neurodivergent people, that meant I needed to hear from them directly and not just build this work on my own experiences as a neurodivergent librarian. So I interviewed 50 neurodivergent librarians, and 17 of them were supervisors. And the goal was really to understand the things that presented barriers to them, the things that were enablers or helped lead to their success, and the work practices that existed in their library organizations. Several themes emerged from these interviews, and that was that there were numerous workplace barriers and enablers existing in library workplaces. The librarians I spoke with also talked a lot about negotiating their identity as a neurodivergent person and what that meant for them. The supervisors I spoke with shared that they encountered many of the same challenges that the other library workers reported, but they also emphasized the strengths that they brought to leadership positions in libraries. And then the final theme was really the nature of this profession and the impact that that had on neurodivergent library workers specifically. So first, I'll talk a little bit about the barriers that the librarians shared with me. And they talked about how often they felt excluded in their library workplace. And things that made them feel excluded were the prevalence of things like negative stereotypes and stigma. They talked a lot about how they feared discrimination in their workplace, and that would prevent them from sharing this aspect of their identity. And that could lead to people feeling very isolated. This was both social isolation and professional isolation. They'd be excluded from, I don't know, I guess we call them like water cooler chats or something, right? But if you think like in the break room, people would meet and get coffee, and the neurodivergent librarians weren't included in those kinds of conversations. And they might get not included in project work or that sort of thing. They also talked a lot about how generally inaccessible their work environment was for them. This could include things like having your workspace in an area of the library where there was a lot of activity, right? So lots of visual distraction or noise distractions, or people talked a lot about terrible overhead lighting. I worked in an office where I never turned on the overhead lighting, so I related very much to that. But it's one of those things that came up a lot, right? So all of the ways in which even the workspace alone made them feel like their presence was not anticipated in this building or in this space. They also talked a lot about how often there are all of these sort of hidden expectations, this hidden curriculum, or things that were so unclear about processes and policies in their workplace. And they might not even know that such a policy existed until they got in trouble for doing something wrong, like, oh, we're not supposed to do that. That's not allowed here. Well, if no one's told you that from the beginning, how can you know that? And so there was always this feeling of like trying to feel your way out without knowing where any of those boundaries were. And again, all of these things are leading to people feeling like their differences aren't welcome. Like there's only one way to be a librarian. And if you don't fit in that mold, then you are not welcome, or, you're isolated and excluded here. For the librarians who were interested in seeking accommodations processes, those processes were highly bureaucratic and very unclear. No one was sure who to contact, or it was handed off to HR. And then there was no communication with HR in the library. And so it became this very burdensome process for people who were interested to pursuing that legal right. Additionally, they often bore this burden of educating their colleagues, of resisting or confronting those stereotypes, or, correcting misconceptions of neurodiversity, or even sort of building that basic awareness. Someone I spoke with talked about how like they were constantly sending their managers articles about neurodiversity, right? So this is the kind of what they're doing, all this additional work of trying to educate their colleagues to make their workplace less exclusive of them. And then all of these barriers were amplified with other intersecting identities, gender identity, racial identity. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but it's important to acknowledge it here as well. So I mentioned this theme of negotiating identity. So many of the library workers that I spoke with had identified their neurodivergence as adults. And this is like 43 of the 50, right? And so this meant then that they were engaged in this process of learning to understand even what it meant now that they had identified their neurodivergence. What were their own needs? What did it mean to be an authentic neurodivergent person for themselves, because they had masked and they'd become so accustomed to adapting on their own without any support. And this meant that sometimes they really struggled. I would ask them what would make your workplace better for you, and they'd really have to think hard about that, because they were so used to taking all of this work upon themselves rather than being able to think about how their workplace practices might adjust to improve their situation. They also talked about how for those of them who had been able to work from home, for example, and just the changing working conditions of the pandemic had demonstrated to them that work could be different for them. They could do their work in a way that was different and less harmful. And so that was really an aha moment for many of the librarians that I spoke with, and often prompted them to sort of begin to change how they were engaging with their workplace. So I mentioned, right, that these barriers that I discussed were amplified with other, what I call here individual differences. And so these individual differences are things that impact the way that a person is present in and understands themselves and their work and their workplace. And this comes from work that seeks to illuminate the factors that enable some people to succeed in the workplace, particularly marginalized people, and the things that enable some of them to succeed while others do not. And so as an example, then this idea of this late identification of neurodivergent really impacted the ways that librarians were present and understanding of their work and their ways of being and what that meant to show up in the workplace and what their needs were. Additionally, the librarians I spoke with, a number of them had experienced trauma in their lives and had a history of trauma. And so that not only influenced how they were seeing themselves and showing up in their workplace, but it also added a layer of working to understand and navigate the things that were triggers in their workplace. And because this trauma was often interwoven with their neurodiversity, then that complicated the interaction of the neurodivergent exclusion and the way that trauma isn't generally understood in library workplaces either. And the librarians that I spoke with who had multiple intersectional identities, they were then also encountering multiple forms of oppression and discrimination in their workplaces. Some of them had even had to pursue discrimination suits. And so this was a serious level of discrimination that people were encountering in their workplaces in these intersectional ways. And lastly, then, I also want to point out that neurodivergent librarians in this highly feminized profession are really expected to perform both neuronormativity because so many neurotypical expectations are centered in library workplaces. But they're also being placed in this role of performing gendered care while their ways of being, their neurodivergence, and other aspects of their identity are misunderstood or even just not acknowledged at all. And so, these are the ways. Sorry, I moved to the other slide there. Let me pop back for a sec. But these are the ways in which all of these individual differences and various backgrounds are playing a significant role in the experiences of workplaces of the neurodivergent library workers. All right, so all of that said, then, I think it's important to also acknowledge that there are all sorts of strengths that neurodivergent people bring to their roles. And this was something that was especially emphasized by those who were in leadership roles. And I really want to emphasize this because research largely reflects the assumption that neurodivergent people are employees but don't hold leadership roles within their organization. And my research definitely demonstrates otherwise. And so, yes, the neurodivergent leaders definitely acknowledged that they encountered many of the same challenges that I have already shared with you. But they also really emphasized that their experiences led them to come to their position of leadership with an orientation that with an orientation towards changing their organization, really changing the practices. They talked about how they were able to be more understanding of differences and empathetic toward their direct reports. They, much more than the neurodivergent librarians, emphasized the ways that they were using the power of their role to create change in their organization. They talked about how they were making their policies clearer. And they talked about how they were working to actively support and hire other neurodivergent employees. They also really stressed the importance of advancing more neurodivergent librarians into these kinds of roles because of these strengths that they brought to the profession and the way that they felt that they were offering new perspectives and helping to advance the profession of librarianship. So, librarianship. I'm actually going to take a sip of coffee before I dig into this one. And I say that laughing because I know you all know, right? This is such a service-oriented profession. If you were at the session prior to this with Tawana Hodge and Abigail Phillips, they were talking about many of these things that I'm going to just briefly touch on here as well. This profession, we're so focused on helping others and meeting their needs. And for neurodivergent librarians, like I think many librarians, right, this is a professional value that aligns well with personal and professional values. And the librarians I spoke with really emphasized how much they valued and found affirming the ability to help others in this profession. And yet, um, we are not, as a profession, so good at extending that same care to ourselves and to others. As I mentioned earlier, and I will say again here, right, we claim to value access and inclusion, and maybe sometimes we're pulling that off for our patrons, but that is very often not the case in library workplaces. Uh, here in the US especially, we are facing so many cuts. There have long been historic underfunding, understaffing, and this continues to result in self-sacrifice as the expected norm. The librarians I spoke with talked about how they were, wearing too many hats because of the cuts that have been happening. They've been, asked to take on the work of their colleagues who had left the library, without those positions being filled again, or and this was often leading to burnout. Additionally, the guiding standards and competencies that we use here that come from the ALA, these all really demand a able librarian, right? Someone who's not just able, but extra able to take on all sorts of additional work, like doing all the work of your colleague who is no longer here in addition to your own work. That's a perfect example of being hyper able. And the ways that these standards and competencies also really prioritize service and helping patrons rather than sort of sustaining or even acknowledging that like library workers could use some care as well. And as I mentioned again, neurotypical expectations dominate throughout this work. That's something that even one of the neurotypical librarians that I spoke with talked about as well. So, like, if neurotypical people are seeing that, then that's the extent to which this is true. And so as a general takeaway then, I would say that the neurodivergent librarians who participate in this research really do believe that there isn't malice at the heart of any of these barriers or their experiences. Well, at least not broadly. There are always some individuals, right? But generally, they believed that their peers really are well-intentioned, but they also acknowledge that workplaces don't become inclusive on good intentions alone. So this is part of why I wanted to talk with neurotypical librarians then and understand some of their neurodiversity knowledge and what they were doing in their workplaces. So I spoke with 36 neurotypical librarians to understand where they were coming from. And generally, they demonstrated a desire to improve, but a lack of know-how. They just didn't know how to dig in to support their neurodivergent colleagues or even where to begin. And they generally lacked knowledge about neurodiversity, particularly what that looked like among adults or in the workplace. They might mention a relative, but that was often a child, right? And so they didn't have this understanding of neurodiversity and like children grow up to be neurodivergent adults. And so that led to, I think is part of what's leading to some of these stereotypes and misconceptions about neurodiversity in the workplace. And also because libraries are so understaffed, people are overworked, and we're still dealing with this ongoing impact of the pandemic and now cuts. There's really minimal capacity for doing that work of taking on anything new. And furthermore, the managers really had never even received managerial training. They were doing that on their own or trying to learn that on the job. And so the things that they were already taking on, they didn't necessarily even have sort of that strong foundation to think about, what we might call best practices or even just good managerial practices. If they did, they'd largely acquired it on their own. And so they told me things like, I want to be an advocate and I don't really know how to advocate. So then how do we help people do that work? How do we help them advocate? And how can we build on those good intentions that I've mentioned here? And how do we respond to this marginalization and exclusion of neurodivergent librarians? Well, the good news is that there are a few things that we can do. But overall, library organizations really have to take those actionable steps towards shifting this organizational culture in ways that normalize and honor differences across the library team. That means addressing all forms of structural exclusion and oppression. It means taking steps to do things like adopt trauma-informed culture, organizational culture here, and practices. It means attending to those gendered conceptions of care and all the ways they show up in this profession. It means valuing and recognizing the expertise of neurodivergent librarians and supervisors without burdening them with additional work. It also means taking up the work of access and inclusion as an organizational culture that requires organizational change. In other words, we need to start enacting some of the core values of the profession within the workplace as well for each other. Because as libraries continue to face challenges and threats, library work is becoming increasingly sustainable. And so we need to find those ways to make this work sustainable for all of us. One of the neurodivergent librarians I interviewed really emphasized this need for a cultural shift, sharing, I wish that people would just understand the brains don't all work the same and that we're not doing things to hurt you. We are just trying to live our lives the same as neurotypical people, and sometimes that looks different. So to take those actionable steps then, here are some of them, because the librarians that I spoke with also emphasized the things that people can do to help make their workplaces more inclusive. And this means things like allowing some flexibility in the schedule. Maybe you can't do that for the information desk, but then if you could be clear about when it's okay to be late and when you need to be on time, even that is helpful communication. Allowing remote or hybrid work as able. People even talked about how, like, even if it was a few hours, one afternoon every other week, it still made a difference. They also really valued the ability to be self-directed and have some autonomy, because that allowed them to manage their energy, their cognitive capacity in ways that aligned with their needs. They also talked about needing a supportive supervisor and team. And so, if you identify as neurotypical, thinking about ways that you can do some of that work of learning yourself and taking up that work of educating yourself on ways to be supportive of your neurodivergent employees, like coming to this kind of session. They also talked a lot, right? I emphasized the inaccessibility of workspaces. And so many of them emphasize the value of a private workspace, or at least being able to go somewhere quiet where they had some sensory control. And a lot of them talked about, like, in an ideal situation, they'd have a space where a door can be closed, even though they acknowledge that, like, not all libraries are that's even a possibility. But they did talk about, for example, managing the break room in a way where that could sometimes be used for a quiet retreat space, that sort of thing. So thinking outside the box about how we provide these private retreat spaces. They also emphasized the need to respect boundaries and mental health support. And sometimes that just meant visibility of practices, policies, like around PTO, right? Paid time off, encouraging people, remember, don't forget to take your PTO, or, having open conversations about mental health in the workplace. Um, Finding ways to build on the strengths of all employees, right? The ways that you can normalize all of these conversations across your whole team will help the neurodivergent librarians at your workplace feel less isolated, less targeted. The same is true of accommodations and adjustments, right? Being able to support those for all employees rather than singling out disabled or neurodivergent employees. And of course, they talked a lot about how much it meant to them to have a neurodivergent supervisor, because that meant you work with someone who got all of this from the beginning. You didn't have to take on that extra work of educating and working with someone who didn't have the necessary information. So in addition to acting some of those enablers in libraries, you can also work to minimize or remove some of the barriers that I outlined earlier. So example, if negative stereotypes or stigma, if those arise in your workplace, are you ready to interrupt and reframe what was said? If not, how do you train, right? How does all of your staff, all of the employees at your library get that practice? Have you had bystander training that you could draw on to be ready to take action when those stereotypes arise in conversation? I talked a lot about the fear of discrimination. So how do you create that psychological safety, right? Do people feel like they won't be penalized for making a mistake, if they can create a plan for going forward? Or is your workplace one where people are always terrified of making a mistake, right? How can you change that organizational culture to create that more safe psychologically workplace? Um, does everyone at your workplace get asked about their needs and encourage adjustments? Some of the neurodivergent supervisors I talked with talked about how they had like a list of things that they would ask new employees, for example, in onboarding. What do you need in your workspace? And obviously, you can't provide everything, but the point is the asking helps begin those conversations. Also, in terms of unclear expectations, do you have transparent communication practices in place? Do you have clear policies? Are your meeting norms clear? One of the people I talked with was serving on their task force to help make their meeting norms more clear, because there was no conversation, and yet there were clearly meeting norms. And so they were working to make those transparent to everyone within the organization. And related to accommodations processes, for example, are you familiar with the accommodations process at your library? Is that something you have talked about as a team? More ways in which we can sort of surface these things and be transparent about them will help people feel like these differences are welcome and supported in library workplaces. And then I'm providing a couple of questions here that you can use then to either reflect on yourself or to facilitate conversations at your library workplace. For example, if you recognize that there's a gap in neurodiversity knowledge at your organization, what do you think people need to know? How can you make that happen? In terms of unclear expectations and policies, what knowledge is taken for granted at your institution? If it's anything like the libraries I worked at, it's probably a lot, right? And so how can you be more effective at sharing that hidden curriculum, that knowledge that's taken for granted? How can you be more transparent about making that information clearly visible and readily available to everyone? And of course, this transparency applies to things like meeting practices, workflows, even preferred collaboration and communication methods, right? Is this something you've talked about at your library? I know since the pandemic, a lot of people have talked about how they've had all of these communication channels sort of multiply at their library. So when do you prefer a chat? When do you prefer email? Having those kinds of conversations, right, will help people even think through their own needs, much less, right, that provide a channel, a more effective channel of communication with across your team for everyone. And then what are the strengths of the people on your team, and how do you do that in a way that is healthy for everyone without being exploitative or extracting labor from people in a way that's harmful? These are the kinds of conversations that can help surface some of the organizational culture issues at your library as well. It's not to say these are easy conversations. This is all complicated and hard work. And I know we're all stretched thin. But in my mind, these are essential for making this work, as I've said, more sustainable for all of us. Neurodivergent librarians are already part of our profession, and estimates are that neurodivergent people are about 20% of the population. So we know that there are neurodivergent people at lots of our library workplaces. And we all have so much to offer, both the profession and our library communities and our library patrons. As one librarian said, we're already here, we're engaged, and we care about the work that we're doing, and we care about this profession. Just make it easier for us, and we have so much to give. Others told me, we want to be in this field, it just needs to be easier. Let us help advance the field. So I hope that you can help take up the work of making workplaces less exclusive of neurodivergent librarians and being aware of some of these barriers. Additionally, as I said, we are working this summer. We just got a little bit of funding. So we will be creating a toolkit that will include training and resources and a success kit that I'm really excited about working on for neurodivergents like me, and more. So please stay tuned for additional details on that, because that will help you begin these conversations and give you some resources to bring back to your workplaces as well. And I promised we would have lots of time for questions and conversations. So I just want to thank all of you for being here, and to our organizers for making this conference possible. And then I also will remind you to please think about these guidelines for your questions. Sometimes people really want me to help them individually, and I'm happy to do that separate from the conference. So here I would really like to focus on questions that would apply broadly. That was hard for me to say. To others in this session, and that you're comfortable asking in front of everyone. and think about how your question relates to the presentation just heard. I would love to fix everyone's organizations. Unfortunately, that is not within my capacity. So thank you, and I will open it up to our time for questions now. I'm going to stop sharing too. And I know there was an active chat and I was not able to follow along while I was presenting, but thank you for everyone who's been involved with that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christine. We have had a very active.
Right, so were there some questions from chat?
There were a few, yes. So
Okay.
let me see. So someone's asked, apart from sharing resources like these slides, what can those of us without decision/policy making powers in our institutions do to support needed culture shifts? And the question asker has said that they recognise this might be very individualised depending on the organisation. So very fair, this isn't really answerable. And I'm just cognizant of your Q&A reminders there.
Yeah, of course, that's always dependent on the organization and in your role. But, I really invite people to think about how you can deploy your sort of circle of influence at your organization. In other words, where can you identify for yourself? Where can you if not enact direct change? Where can you exert influence? So for example, I was an instruction librarian and we needed to update our website. And so I saw that as an opportunity to start having some conversations about accessibility. And I would bring to our meetings about our website update information about accessibility and disabilities and neurodiversity. And so it's, how can you be sort of sneaky about beginning these conversations at your library in ways that are within the scope of your role, especially if you're at an organization where that organizational hierarchy and culture is a complicated one. And so, I guess that's kind of been my approach, is figure out where and when you can enact some influence. And maybe it's only on an individual basis, right? And that any steps you can take will be noticed and are good steps, because there are so many barriers that it's going to take a lot of work to address them. Yes, but I think the librarians that I spoke with, a number of them talked about, like, man, we are giving so much to be here. If someone could just take one step towards us, that would make all of the difference. And so, yeah, I think that's my point. One step in the right direction is still a great step in the right direction.
Great, thank you. Someone else has asked, and I think it's kind of a partner question to what I just asked, is about what can MD librarians do to help each other, and what can we, or they, I will say, because I'm not neurodivergent myself, what can they put in place? And I think here in the UK, we've got a network called the Neurodivergent Library and Information Staff Network, which someone from there has asked me to pass on to you their details, because they're interested in you speaking at one of their events. So have you learned about anything in the States around that, and have you got anything similar in the States?
We do not have something like that in the United States. In fact, that's one of the things that some of the neurodivergent librarians that I talked with mentioned that they would love is more of that community, because especially if you're in a workplace where you don't feel like that's something you can share about your identity, it's really important to have that space where you are seen as a professional, as a neurodivergent person. And unfortunately, there just isn't an organization like that. A couple people mentioned how they would love to see something like that associated with ALA here in the US. Other people felt like ALA was problematic, and not a good organization to be associated with. And so, one of the things that I guess I would say to neurodivergent people is that it is really important to find your people. And whether that's, through within your own workplace or in your social circle, or here in the US, for example, we have a lot of state library organizations. Some of them you have more flexibility in creating those kinds of identity-oriented groups. And so, finding ways to connect with others. Unfortunately, I don't have the capacity to make that happen. And there are some places that have been trying to start that, but there isn't one big place to have that happen just yet. So think locally, I guess, is my encouragement at the moment, because that connection to community is really important as well.
Great, thank you. So we've got a couple of questions about the toolkit. So someone's asked, what stage are you at
Sure.
with the toolkit? And around funding as well, if you're able to or would like to answer that, if how confident you are about
Yeah.
getting something, etc.
Yeah. So I should be getting confirmation of that funding this week. We have secured monies to make that happen. Um, Again, it's been an ongoing process, and so that's why I'm sighing. All of this IMLS grant termination process has been really difficult to navigate, and very tiring. But we have secured the funding. We are at the beginning stages of actually building it, right? So we have the plan. We know all of the things that we want to create. I am currently working on a timeline. The goal is to hopefully finish it by the summer. We are also hoping that our funding will enable us to have a grad student to help me with that, so I don't have to build it all by myself. But that is where we are at right now. And so, unfortunately, that's like as soon as I get the email, but like it's literally one of those things where, yeah, it's been such a process, and we should have all of that in place soon. And I promise I will hit the ground running, because I know so many people are waiting for this and looking forward to it. So I have my list. I'm going to get to it as soon as I get that email.
That's brilliant. That's really great to hear. Thank you so much. I haven't seen any other questions in the chat, so and I don't see anyone's hands up either. So does anyone have any final questions that they would like to ask Christine? Okay. I mean, I will ask this question, but I'm not sure whether it will be answerable or within the kind of guidelines. So so someone up thread mentioned clashing ND needs. How do you accommodate directly opposing needs, e.g. an ADHD manager who needs to throw ideas at you all the time versus with an autistic employee who needs clear instructions and expectations? So I'll leave that up to you whether or not you answer that.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? One of the things that came up in the interviews, and then especially in our survey, was the way that I wouldn't say that like an ADHDer versus an autistic librarian necessarily encountered different barriers. What I would say is that they experience them maybe to different degrees. And I think your example here is a really good one. And, you know, again, this is coming back to the idea that I shared about like being very clear about how you work together, having those conversations, right? Does the autistic employee in this example understand that the ADHD manager needs to throw ideas out all the time, right? Have you talked about that process and how to communicate those instructions clearly? Right? Maybe, for example, and of course, I'm just, you know, I don't have context here, right? But maybe, for example, it might be helpful for this ADHD manager who's throwing out ideas all the time to then either conclude the meeting with the autistic employee or to follow up the meeting with those clear instructions and expectations. And so that way you're navigating together in a way that meets both people's needs. But again, it's, you know, transparency and communication about how we effectively work together and collaborate and what works best. And I think people, at least certainly the librarians I spoke with, are willing to put in the work to navigate those processes and to acknowledge and make space for those conflicting needs. But we have to talk about them and be aware of them, and then do the work of figuring out how to meet needs in a way that carries the work forward as well.
Great.
I hope that helps address that question.
Yes, the person who asked the question said, thank you so much for taking the time to answer.
Yeah.
Again, I haven't seen any further questions in the chat. So unless one comes up while I'm wrapping up, we will say thank you so much to Christine. Thank you so much for joining us so early in your morning as well. It's, what is it, around 10-ish a.m. in Seattle? Are you in Seattle?
Seattle, yes, it is a little bit before 10:30 here in Seattle. So thank you all for being here. I know for many of you it's late in the day. So I just really appreciate you spending time with me and hearing about this work. And I hope you found something that you can take back to your library organization as well.
Yeah, thank you. From the chat, I think people have really resonated with your talk. So thank you so much. I would just stop recording.